William Still was born October 7, 1821, in a remote corner of the southern New Jersey pinelands, the youngest of 18 children of Levin and Charity Steele. Their home was, as William's older brother recalled, a log house with one door and no glass windows in it, on the southern edge of Burlington County in what is now Chemung Township, but which was then part of Washington Township, a few miles east of the small town of Medford. The soil was sandy, and the Stills' property was one of the small farms that had been carved out of the pine forest that to this day stretches over the gently undulating ground of southern New Jersey. Black residents, the vast majority of them free, made up less than 5% of the population in Burlington County, and while robust black communities could be found in parts of the county, the Stills settled in an area where they were one of few black families. What had brought the Still family to this place? Neither Levin nor Charity had been born in New Jersey. Both had been born into slavery, 100 miles to the south on the eastern shore of Maryland, in Caroline County. In contrast to Dorchester County, to its immediate south, bordering the Chesapeake, Caroline County, inland and abutting the state of Delaware along its eastern border, contained somewhat fewer slaves, about 20% of the population in 1800. As young children, both had been enslaved to one William Banning, but when Banning died in 1780, Levin, who was then about 10, became the property of his widow, Margaret, while Charity, then about 8 and known as Sidney, passed to Banning's daughter, Lydia Morton, who later sold her to Alexander Griffith, a man William Still would later remember as Saunders Griffin. Margaret Banning died soon after her husband, and Levin became the property of her grandson, William Wood, who was about the same age as Levin. Slavery had been the foundation of the economy in this part of Maryland for more than a century, but that economy was changing. The turbulence of the American Revolution helped catalyze a significant shift. Planters who had once almost exclusively focused on a single crop, tobacco, now increasingly grew grains, fruits, and vegetables, and raised livestock. Wheat in particular found a ready market across the Atlantic as the French Revolution and its aftermath disrupted agriculture across Europe. With this diversified agricultural economy came a corresponding demand for different kinds of labor and a transformation in the seasonal rhythms of production. Wheat, for example, required 2 intense periods of labor during its cultivation, planting and harvest. At these times, farmers sought all the work they could get. The rest of the year, however, there was far less to be done in order to tend to the crop. This posed a problem for planters, who saw that their enslaved labor force continued to grow over these years. Ever creative in their exploitation of slave labor, masters turned this problem into an opportunity. In the decades which followed the American Revolution, slave laborers were put to work grinding grain, tending livestock, and transporting crops to market. They worked as coopers, smiths, millers, and tanners. While slave masters did their best to get the most value out of their enslaved property, there was a growing sense among the planters of the Chesapeake region that they had more slave labor than they needed. Some responded by selling slaves south and west to the burgeoning cotton frontier, where the lust for slave labor was almost insatiable. The division of enslaved families became the hallmark of this generation of Chesapeake slavery. Other masters hired out underused slaves for a period of time. Many of these hired-out slaves were put to work in towns, large and small, across the region. There was also the escalating fear among masters that their property in slaves was endangered by the possibility of flight. Slaves had always run away, of course, but the gradual abolition of slavery in the states just north of Maryland, along with the growth of free black populations closer to home, especially in Baltimore, where fugitives might find refuge, meant that fugitives were ever more likely to be successful in evading recapture. Enslaved Marylanders were quick to take advantage of these conditions. Masters were desperate to find some way to control enslaved property that seemed increasingly beyond their control, and as a result, more and more were willing to negotiate with their slaves in order to secure them as long as possible. For some, this would provide a path to freedom. Levin Steele was one of these who made his desires clear. "I'd sooner die than stay a slave," he told his master. Rather than risk losing his slave for nothing, Levin Steele's young master agreed to allow him to purchase his own freedom. They settled on a price, and then it fell to Levin to find ways to meet that price. The complex economy of the Chesapeake presented opportunities for a man like Levin to make extra money, but this was, of course, for work done above what was already demanded of him by his master. He would have had to work late into the night, and on the Sundays that slaves were typically given off. Often, enslaved families pooled their labor to pay for the manumission of a single member. Perhaps this was the case for the Steele family. Levin was resolute, and on November 22, 1798, his efforts were rewarded. His master, William Wood, signed his manumission. Levin was 24 years old, and it had taken him years and sacrifices at which we can only guess to buy his own freedom.